You think politics can wait until you land? Think again. On this flight, a pilot broke all the rules, confronting a controversial duo, and what happened next shocked the entire country. What began as a routine flight turned into a viral showdown no one, not even the passengers on board, saw coming. It was a clear, quiet Thursday morning. A commercial flight had just taken off from Dallas, Texas, en route to Washington, D.C. Everything about it seemed normal. The skies were clear. Turbulence was minimal, and the cabin crew moved through the aisles offering drinks and light snacks. First class was nearly full. Businessmen on laptops, frequent flyers flipping through magazines, and a few political staffers dozing off under cashmere blankets. Among the first-class passengers were Leavitt, a rising congressional candidate, known for her bold, unapologetically conservative stances, and her travel companion, David Crockett, a controversial political commentator with a loyal following and an even longer list of critics. They sat in the second row of first class, chatting quietly and sipping coffee. Leavitt was reviewing notes on her tablet, preparing for a live television interview scheduled in D.C. later that afternoon. Crockett, always camera-ready, was wearing his signature blazer and sunglasses, occasionally looking out the window and cracking jokes under his breath. To the casual observer, they might have looked like any other pair of professionals traveling for work. But for those who recognized them, especially Crockett, who was often at the center of political firestorms, there was a clear tension in the air. A few passengers took notice. A woman in 3A nudged her husband, whispering, "Is that David?" "Crockett?" He squinted and nodded. Soon, murmurs spread quietly through the cabin. Some passengers leaned in a little too obviously, and a few phones discreetly hovered as people pretended to scroll, just in case something interesting happened. And then, something did. Roughly 40 minutes into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed for passenger comfort. The plane was soaring steadily at 30,000 feet. Most assumed the cockpit crew was fully focused on navigating the airspace above the eastern seaboard. But suddenly, the cockpit door opened. Out stepped the pilot. It's not unusual for pilots to take a brief break during cruise altitude. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't just that the pilot came out. It was how he walked and where he was going. He wasn't stretching his legs or checking in with flight attendants. He was walking directly toward Leavitt and Crockett. Tall and imposing, with a squared jaw and mirrored aviators still on, the pilot moved with purpose. His expression was unreadable. Passengers nearby stiffened in their seats, confused. Was something wrong? A security issue? An emergency? As he approached their row, Leavitt looked up, puzzled. Crockett raised an eyebrow and slowly took off his sunglasses, perhaps thinking he was about to be recognized for a selfie request. But instead of a polite greeting, what came next left jaws hanging. In a low but firm voice, just loud enough for the front rows to hear, the pilot leaned in and said, "Ma'am, I know who you are. And I just want to say, I don't agree with you. Or him." Leavitt blinked. "Excuse me?" she asked, caught off guard. The pilot continued, "I think what you're doing, what both of you represent, is dangerous. People like you are dividing this country, spreading fear, misinformation." Crockett straightened up, eyes narrowing. The passengers nearby stopped pretending to ignore what was happening. Several had already started recording on their phones. Leavitt kept her composure. "Sir," she began, "we're just trying to get to D.C. for an interview. We're not here to argue." But the pilot wasn't done. "This isn't about politics anymore," he said. "It's about decency, and you two have crossed the line." There was an eerie silence. Leavitt glanced toward a flight attendant, who stood frozen, unsure how to react. Crockett, always one to fire back, leaned forward and said, "We're paying customers. You're a pilot. Fly the plane." The pilot stared for a moment longer, then said something even more bizarre. "Just so you know, I've made a call. There'll be someone waiting when we land. Let's see how this plays out." With that, he turned and walked back to the cockpit, leaving behind a stunned first-class cabin and a trail of questions. Had the pilot just made a threat? Was this some kind of political stunt? Was there actual danger? Passengers looked around, nervously. Leavitt leaned back slowly, her eyes still locked on the closed cockpit door. Crockett muttered under his breath, "This is going to be fun." Little did they know. The real twist was still waiting on the ground. The atmosphere in first class was thick with tension, the kind you could feel, like static in the air before a lightning strike. Flight attendants glided up and down the aisle with forced smiles, their posture just a little too stiff, their voices slightly too chipper. But even they couldn't ignore the undercurrent of unease. Several passengers had already recognized David Crockett, the conservative firebrand famous, or infamous depending on who you asked, for his passionate rants and controversial commentary. He was the kind of man people either loved or hated. And on this flight, it was clear that not everyone was a fan. Whispers started to ripple through the cabin. Some passengers pointed discreetly, others looked on with thinly veiled curiosity. A few tried to sneak photos, angling their phones just right, pretending to take selfies. But the focus was always on Crockett and his companion, Leavitt, the rising political figure whose campaign had made waves nationwide for its unfiltered, bold stances. As the murmurs grew louder, so did the pressure in the air. And then it happened. The cockpit door opened with a subtle click. A tall figure stepped out, the pilot, unmistakable in his crisp uniform, silver hair neatly combed, and mirrored aviators that gave him a no-nonsense, old-school presence. He looked like someone who belonged in a movie, the cool, unshakable captain who always had everything under control. But his stride wasn't casual. He wasn't stretching his legs or checking on the flight crew. He was walking with purpose, straight down the aisle, directly toward Leavitt and Crockett. The cabin hushed. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the clink of glasses and the hum of engines seemed to fade as every eye in first class turned toward the unfolding scene. The pilot stopped right in front of them. He looked first at Leavitt, then at Crockett, then back again. And then, in a calm, even tone, the kind that made the words hit even harder, he said, "Ma'am, I know who you are. And I just have to say, I don't agree with you or your friend. People like you are what's tearing this country apart." Gasps were audible. One woman in 1C physically leaned back in her seat. A man 2 rows back started recording. No more pretending. Leavitt's eyes widened in disbelief. She wasn't a stranger to confrontation, but this, being called out mid-flight by the pilot, was something else entirely. She blinked. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but sharp. Crockett, never one to be silent in the face of provocation, slowly turned his head, lifting his sunglasses in that slow, deliberate way that suggested he was preparing for battle. "Did you seriously just say that?" he asked, his voice steady but loaded with warning. The pilot didn't flinch. "You're entitled to your opinion," he said, "but I'm entitled to mine. And I think it's disgusting how you two spread misinformation and pretend it's patriotism." The cabin was dead silent. Passengers were frozen, some watching wide-eyed, others awkwardly trying to look away while still listening intently. Leavitt straightened in her seat. "Sir, with all due respect, we're passengers on this flight. Paying customers, this isn't the time or place for personal politics." But the pilot stood his ground. "It's always the time for truth," he replied. "I've flown this country coast to coast for over 20 years, and lately I see more division, more hate, more fear, and it's voices like yours that pour fuel on the fire." Crockett's eyes flashed. "You don't even know us," he snapped. "You're making assumptions because we think differently than you. That's not truth. That's bias." The tension hit a breaking point. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances. One of them, a younger woman with a headset, slowly approached, whispering something to the pilot. He nodded, but didn't move yet. Then, almost like he was delivering a final mic drop, the pilot added, "Just so you know, I've made a call. There will be someone waiting for you when we land." And with that, he turned and walked away. Calm, deliberate, as though nothing had just happened. Leavitt sat frozen, lips parted slightly in shock. Crockett leaned back, shaking his head and muttering, "Unbelievable." Around them, the cabin slowly came back to life. But it wasn't the same. A low buzz of whispered speculation returned. Phones were definitely recording now. No one knew what the pilot meant by someone waiting, but it sent a ripple of unease through everyone who heard it. Was it a threat? A warning? An overstep? Of authority? One thing was certain. This flight was no longer just a flight. It was now a headline in the making, and the world would be watching when they landed. Leavitt was no stranger to confrontation. On campaign trails, on cable news panels, even in college debates, she had faced tough questions and tougher critics. But this moment, 30,000 feet in the air, was different. It wasn't a journalist questioning her platform. It wasn't an internet troll firing off angry tweets. It was a pilot, the person responsible for safely flying her across the country, now standing just inches from her seat, leveling accusations with barely controlled intensity, trying. To keep her composure, Leavitt sat up straighter, folded her hands in her lap, and calmly said, "Sir, we're just passengers on a plane. You're the pilot. Shouldn't you be focusing on flying safely instead of political grandstanding?" Her tone was measured, but her words carried weight. There was an unspoken challenge in her voice. Do your job. The pilot didn't back down. "You're right," he admitted, nodding slightly. "I should be focused on flying, and I am. But I also believe in saying what's right. And frankly, you two represent something dangerous, and I couldn't stay silent any longer." A wave of murmurs swept through the nearby seats. Leavitt's face remained unreadable, but Crockett's did not. He leaned forward in his seat, eyes sharp, voice rising just enough for nearby passengers to hear clearly. "We represent freedom of speech," Crockett said. "Something you clearly don't understand." His words cut like a blade. The pilot clenched his jaw for a second, not angry but visibly irritated, as though he'd expected resistance but not quite this level of defiance. "You have freedom of speech," the pilot replied. "But freedom isn't a shield from consequences. And the rhetoric you two push, it tears people apart, it fuels hate, it misleads millions." Crockett smirked, clearly unfazed. "So now you're the truth police," he said. "Flying a plane and fact-checking passengers at the same time. Impressive." The back and forth was heating up, and tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Several passengers had stopped pretending to mind their own business. Phones were out, some recording subtly, others brazenly held high. The scene unfolding in front of them wasn't something you saw every day, or ever. A flight attendant, clearly uncomfortable, stepped forward. She was in her early 30s, blonde hair pinned tightly back, hands clasped nervously in front of her. She leaned in toward the pilot and whispered something. Passengers couldn't hear what she said, but her body language told the story. "Please go. Back. You're making people uncomfortable. This isn't protocol." The pilot gave her a glance, nodded ever so slightly, and then turned back to Leavitt and Crockett. "I'll leave you alone now," he said. "But just so you know." He paused, then delivered the line that froze the entire front of the plane. "I've rerouted the plane. There's someone who wants to talk to you when we land." For a few long seconds, silence hung in the air like fog. Gasps, audible gasps. One woman clutched the armrest of her seat. A man in 4B whispered, "Did he just say, rerouted?" Leavitt's eyes narrowed. "What did you just say?" she asked slowly, her voice low and deadly serious. But the pilot was already turning away, heading back toward the cockpit. The moment he disappeared behind the cockpit door and it clicked shut, the whispers erupted. "Is that even legal? Did he really reroute the plane? Was that a threat? Is this a joke? This can't be real. Some people laughed nervously. Others were visibly shaken. The once comfortable atmosphere of first class now felt like a pressure cooker. Crockett turned to Leavitt and said, half joking, "You know, I expected turbulence on this flight, but not that kind." She didn't smile. "Something's not right," she said quietly. She wasn't just thinking about herself or Crockett. She was thinking about the implications, the power a pilot holds, the trust passengers put in them, and what happens when that line gets blurred by politics, bias, or personal emotion. The flight attendants moved with more urgency now, whispering among themselves. One was visibly on the phone, likely with the cockpit or airline operations. Meanwhile, Crockett had pulled out his phone and started recording a video of his own. "Folks," he said, looking into the lens, "you won't believe what just happened on this flight. A pilot confronted us in the middle of the sky, accused us of being dangerous, and claimed the plane was rerouted. This is real, and it's terrifying. Whether it was a bluff, a warning, or a threat, no one knew. But everyone on board felt it. Something unusual, and possibly explosive, was waiting for them on the ground." The rest of the flight passed in near total silence. The once lively first-class cabin was now a quiet, tense space. Passengers whispered occasionally, but most simply stared ahead, nervously checking their watches, phones, or each other. No one knew exactly what the pilot had meant when he said the plane was rerouted and someone was waiting to speak with Leavitt and Crockett. But the possibilities, from arrest to protest to full-blown media ambush, loomed large in everyone's mind. Leavitt sat with her arms crossed, her jaw tight. Crockett, meanwhile, had resumed recording on his phone, documenting everything. The political commentator was no stranger to drama, but even for him, this felt like uncharted territory. When the wheels touched down at Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C., a subtle collective exhale moved through the cabin. The landing was smooth, but the mood was anything but. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers craned their necks to look out the windows, searching the tarmac for signs of what was to come. Were those security vehicles? Were reporters really waiting? Was this going to get worse? Or was it all just bluster? The seatbelt sign dinged, and flight attendants began the routine disembarkation announcements. But no one was listening. All eyes were on the front of the plane. And then, the twist. As Leavitt and Crockett stood, gathered their belongings, and made their way toward the exit, the air inside the jet bridge buzzed with anticipation. They stepped off the plane, and immediately, flashbulbs, dozens of them. Reporters stood just beyond the gate, microphones extended, cameras rolling. But that wasn't the biggest surprise. Standing right in front of them, flanked by two senior executives in business suits, was the CEO of the airline himself. Yes, the CEO had flown in that morning on a private jet, alerted mid-flight by both cabin crew reports and videos that had already begun circulating online. He stepped forward calmly and extended his hand. "Ms. Leavitt, Mr. Crockett, I'm the CEO of this airline. I want to personally apologize for what happened on your flight." Crockett blinked, momentarily thrown off. Leavitt glanced sideways at him, then shook the CEO's hand. The CEO continued, looking directly at the cameras now. "Let me be very clear. What happened on board Flight 428 was completely unacceptable. Our pilots are held to the highest standards of professionalism, safety, and neutrality. While we encourage free expression in personal lives, once that uniform goes on, our duty is to treat every passenger with respect, regardless of their beliefs." Gasps and murmurs rose from the reporters. The CEO didn't stop there. "We've already grounded the pilot pending a full investigation. His actions do not reflect the values of this company. Political neutrality and the safety, emotional and physical, of our passengers is not just a policy. It's a promise." Cameras clicked. Microphones were thrust forward. One reporter shouted, "Do you support Leavitt and Crockett's views?" Another yelled, "Is the pilot being fired?" The CEO kept his cool. This isn't about endorsing anyone's political beliefs. It's about upholding a standard of professionalism. What passengers believe is their right. What our crew does in uniform is our responsibility. Crockett looked into the cameras and smirked. Looks like free speech still has a place in America after all. Leavitt, more reserved, added, "We didn't come here looking for a confrontation. We boarded a plane like any other citizen. What happened shouldn't happen to anyone, left, right, or center." As the two walked away from the gate area, reporters swarmed behind, yelling questions and pointing boom mics in their direction. Meanwhile, social media had already exploded. Clips recorded on the plane had gone viral. On X, formerly Twitter, the hashtag #pilot confrontation trended at #1 within hours. News outlets were already running headlines like, "Pilot calls out, conservative duo, mid-flight." "Airline apologizes after political confrontation in first class, hero or out." Of line, pilot sparks nationwide debate. Comment sections ignited with opinions. Some hailed the pilot as a brave truth-teller. Others called his actions dangerous and unprofessional. Political commentators from both sides dove in, dissecting every second of the exchange. Meanwhile, the airline's stock dropped slightly before rebounding once the CEO's swift response made headlines. Within 24 hours, major talk shows were booking Leavitt and Crockett. The incident had transformed from an in-flight disruption to a full-blown national flashpoint, and all because on one routine flight across the country, a pilot stepped out of the cockpit and into the spotlight. In the days that followed that fateful flight, the world couldn't stop talking about it. The video, shaky, raw, but impossible to ignore, racked up millions of views across every major social media platform. From TikTok to Twitter, from YouTube to Instagram, clips of the pilot confronting Leavitt and Crockett spread like wildfire. It wasn't just a viral video. It was a flashpoint in an already divided nation. Talk shows jumped on the story immediately. Late-night hosts, news anchors, political commentators, they all had something to say. The debate wasn't just about what happened on the plane anymore. It was about what it meant. Podcasts dissected every word, analyzing tone, intent, and the broader cultural context. It became one of the hottest topics, with shows from across the political spectrum dedicating entire episodes to breaking down the confrontation. And as the conversation snowballed, Americans everywhere took sides. On one side were those who praised the pilot as a hero, a man brave enough to speak truth to power in a climate of fear and censorship. They said he reminded the country that real patriots call out falsehoods and dangerous rhetoric, no matter where it comes from. To these supporters, the pilot's words were a wake-up call, a symbol of resistance against what they see as the unchecked spread of misinformation. But on the other side were those who condemned him, calling the pilot's actions a blatant abuse of power and a breach of the sacred trust passengers place in the crew. They argued that the cockpit is no place for political battles and that the pilot's intervention could have compromised safety or escalated tensions to a dangerous level. For them, this wasn't courage. It was reckless behavior that endangered the very people he was supposed to protect. Amid the chaos, Leavitt seized the moment to double down on her platform. In interviews and social media posts, she framed the pilot's confrontation as undeniable proof that free speech is under attack. She promised her supporters that she would fight even harder to protect conservative voices and ensure that political dissent was never silenced, especially in public spaces. Her campaign gained traction off the controversy, mobilizing voters who felt the culture wars were now at a critical tipping point. David Crockett, ever the media-savvy commentator, capitalized on the story as well, but with his own unique spin. He recorded an entire podcast episode titled, "How I Survived a Woke Pilot at 30,000 Feet." With a mix of humor, outrage, and political analysis, Crockett broke down the encounter, painting himself and Leavitt as victims of a growing intolerance from what he dubbed the woke establishment. The episode quickly climbed podcast charts, resonating with listeners who felt similarly targeted in their daily lives. Meanwhile, the pilot, who until then had remained silent publicly, broke his silence, but carefully. Through a lawyer, he released a brief but powerful statement. "I spoke from the heart. Maybe I should have stayed silent. But I don't regret standing up for what I believe." His words struck a chord with many who admired his honesty and conviction, even if they didn't agree with everything he said. The airline, caught in the middle of the storm, acted swiftly. Recognizing the immense public scrutiny and the potential fallout, the company announced a new policy. Pilots and crew are now strictly prohibited from engaging in political conversations or confrontations with passengers while on duty. The airline's leadership emphasized that the focus must always be on safety, professionalism, and respect for all travelers, regardless of political beliefs. They pledged to reinforce training and oversight to prevent any future incidents like this. And so, the story that began as a mid-air confrontation became much more. It became a symbol of the deeper, often painful tensions bubbling beneath the surface of American society. A story about freedom, of speech, of belief, and of expression. A story about civility, or the lack thereof, and how polarized voices can sometimes drown out respect and understanding. And a story about boundaries, about how far is too far when standing up for what you believe. In the end, Flight 428's shocking encounter wasn't just about politics. It was a mirror reflecting the divisions and challenges America faces today. A reminder that in a country so rich in diversity of thought, the struggle to balance passion with respect, conviction with compassion, is ongoing and more important than ever. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this story as intense and fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps out the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss one of our incredible stories. Got thoughts on this showdown? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear what you think. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.